High atop the wind-swept ridges of Pennsylvania's Allegheny Mountains, where fog clings to ancient forests and winter winds howl through abandoned structures, lies a story that has been buried beneath layers of time and silence. This is not the story of Andrew Carnegie's celebrated castle in Scotland, nor his opulent mansion in New York City. This is the story of the fortress that never was, the dream that died with his mother, and the land that became something far darker than anyone could have imagined. In 1886, Andrew Carnegie stood at the pinnacle of American industry. His steel empire had made him the wealthiest man in the nation, perhaps the world. At 51 years old, he commanded resources that could have purchased entire cities. Yet for all his power and influence, there was one thing his fortune could not protect. One person whose happiness mattered more to him than all the steel rails in America. That person was his mother, Margaret Carnegie. Margaret Morrison Carnegie was a formidable woman who had guided her son from poverty in Scotland to the heights of American success. She had mortgaged their modest home to buy Andrew his first shares in the Adams Express Company, the investment that would set him on his path to unimaginable wealth. She had been his closest confidant, his anchor, and in many ways the true architect of his empire. When Andrew spoke of building something magnificent, something that would stand as a monument to their shared journey from rags to riches, Margaret's eyes would light up with the fire that had never dimmed despite decades of hardship and struggle. The place Carnegie chose for this monument was Cresson, a small mountain resort town in Cambria County, Pennsylvania. Since 1874, Andrew and Margaret had spent their summers in a modest cottage there, escaping the suffocating heat and industrial smoke of Pittsburgh. The cottage, which Margaret had named Braemar after a village in the Scottish Highlands, was comfortable but simple. It stood on land leased from the Pennsylvania Railroad, overlooking the verdant valleys and rolling peaks of the Alleghenies. For more than a decade, this had been their sanctuary, their place of peace away from the ceaseless demands of the steel industry. But by 1886, Carnegie had grander visions. He purchased 500 acres of pristine land on Cresson Summit, the highest point in the region. Here, he would build something extraordinary, something that would combine his love of Scottish architecture with the cutting-edge technology that had made him wealthy. He envisioned a Scottish baronial castle, complete with turrets and towers, stone battlements and sweeping vistas. It would be a fortress of comfort, a place where his aging mother could spend her final years in luxury and dignity. To design this dream, Carnegie turned to Frederick Law Olmsted, America's most celebrated landscape architect. Olmsted had designed Central Park in New York, the grounds of the Capitol in Washington, and countless estates for the nation's elite. His vision for the Cresson property was breathtaking. The plans called for a massive stone castle built from local limestone and granite, with towers rising 4 stories high. There would be formal gardens designed in the Scottish style, with heather and roses, stone fountains and reflecting pools. Winding carriage paths would snake through carefully cultivated forests. A private lake would be created for boating and fishing. The estate would be entirely self-sufficient, with its own power generation, water systems, and even a small farm to provide fresh food. The architectural plans were equally ambitious. The castle would contain more than 60 rooms, including a great hall with vaulted ceilings and massive stone fireplaces, a library that could house thousands of volumes, private suites for family and guests, servants' quarters, and even a small chapel. Carnegie insisted on incorporating the latest technology, electric lighting throughout, central heating via steam radiators, an internal elevator, and running water with modern plumbing. It would be a medieval fortress, reimagined for the industrial age, a place where history and progress merged into something unique. Construction was scheduled to begin in the spring of 1887. Olmsted's crews had already begun surveying the land, marking where foundations would be dug and roads would be cut. Local quarries prepared to provide the thousands of tons of stone that would be needed. Carnegie commissioned craftsmen from Scotland to create the ornate woodwork, stained glass, and decorative elements that would give the castle its authentic Highland character. He spoke excitedly about showing his mother the progress, about the day when she would walk through the completed castle and see her son's ultimate triumph. But that day would never come. In November of 1886, as an early winter descended on the mountains, Andrew Carnegie fell desperately ill with typhoid fever. He was confined to the modest Braemar cottage, too weak to be moved as his fever raged and his strength ebbed. Margaret, despite her own failing health, stayed by his bedside, nursing him with the same fierce determination that had carried their family through decades of struggle. The cottage, built only for summer use, had no central heating. They relied on open log fires for warmth as snow began to fall outside and temperatures plummeted. As Andrew slowly began to recover, fighting his way back from the edge of death, tragedy struck with brutal suddenness. Margaret Carnegie contracted pneumonia. In that cold cottage, with November winds rattling the windows and howling through the mountains, she grew weaker. Andrew, still too ill to rise from his own bed, could hear her struggling to breathe in the room across the hall. He called for the best doctors, offered any amount of money for treatment, but medicine in 1886 had no answer for pneumonia in a 76-year-old woman. On November 15th, Margaret Carnegie died. The woman who had sacrificed everything for her son, who had seen him rise from a 13-year-old bobbin boy in a cotton mill to the richest man in America, was gone. According to reports, to keep news of her death from Andrew while he was still gravely ill, her coffin was lowered out of the first-floor window, removed from the cottage in secret so her son would not hear and suffer a relapse. When Andrew finally learned of his mother's death, something broke inside him. The man who had been planning the greatest private residence in Pennsylvania, who had commissioned Olmsted to create a Highland paradise on the mountaintop, could not bear to return to Cresson. The very land that was to have been Margaret's crowning glory had become the site of her death. The castle that was meant to honor her would now only serve as a monument to his failure to protect her. Within weeks, Carnegie made a decision that shocked his architects, his business associates, and everyone who knew about the ambitious project. He sold the 500 acres to the state of Pennsylvania for $1. The only condition he attached to the sale was that the land be used to build a tuberculosis sanatorium, a place where others suffering from deadly illness might find healing in the mountain air. It was as if he was trying to transform the site of his personal tragedy into something that could save other families from similar grief. The architectural plans were shelved. Olmsted's beautiful drawings were filed away, never to be realized. The stones that had been quarried sat unused. The craftsmen from Scotland were sent home. The cottage where Margaret had died would eventually pass into other hands, becoming the subject of historical confusion for decades as people tried to determine which of the several cottages in Cresson had actually been Carnegie's. The Steel King never set foot in Cresson again. He abandoned not just the castle plans but the entire region, as if by leaving he could somehow leave his grief behind. But the story of Carnegie's silent fortress does not end there. It transforms, darkens, and takes on dimensions that Carnegie himself could never have imagined. If you're finding this story compelling and want to hear more forgotten histories and untold tales, please subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for notifications. We uncover the stories that time tried to bury, bringing you the hidden narratives behind the headlines. True to his word, the state of Pennsylvania used Carnegie's donated land to build the Cresson Tuberculosis Sanatorium. Construction began in 1911, and the facility opened in 1916. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn, because the architects and planners made a decision that seems almost too strange to be coincidence. They built the sanatorium in a Tudor revival style, with steep gables, elaborate stonework, and castle-like features. The complex featured decorative elements that included gargoyles, carved Scottish crests, and medieval architectural flourishes. It was as if someone had taken Carnegie's abandoned castle plans and twisted them into something entirely different, transforming a dream of luxury and comfort into an institution of isolation and suffering. The resemblance to what Carnegie's castle might have looked like was uncanny. The Crescent Sanatorium rose from the same summit where the Steel King had planned his Scottish fortress. It commanded the same sweeping views. It was built of the same local stone, but instead of being filled with family and friends, with laughter and music and celebration, it housed the desperately ill, the dying, the isolated victims of the white plague that was tuberculosis. For decades, patients arrived at Crescent seeking the cure that mountain air and rest were supposed to provide. They lived in castle-like surroundings, but these were prison surroundings. Tuberculosis was highly contagious, and patients were isolated from their families and the outside world. They spent months, sometimes years, on open-air porches, wrapped in blankets against the cold, breathing the thin mountain air in the hope that their diseased lungs might heal. Many did recover. Many more died, buried in a cemetery on the grounds, joining Margaret Carnegie in eternal rest on this haunted summit. The Grace Chapel, built in 1914 and refurbished in 1947, stood at the heart of the complex. Its Gothic architecture echoed the religious spaces that Carnegie had planned for his own castle. But while Carnegie had envisioned a private family chapel, a place for quiet contemplation and thanksgiving, this chapel served a grimmer purpose. It was where tuberculosis patients attended services, where families held memorial services for loved ones who had died far from home, where the staff gathered to find strength to face another day of suffering and death. Between 1916 and 1964, approximately 40,000 patients passed through Crescent Sanatorium. The tuberculosis epidemic was finally brought under control by antibiotics, particularly streptomycin, which became widely available in the 1940s and 50s. As the need for tuberculosis treatment declined, the facility underwent its next transformation. In 1956, it became the Lawrence F. Flick State Hospital, named for the pioneering physician who had fought to establish tuberculosis treatment centers. But this new incarnation was in some ways even darker than the first. The hospital now housed patients with severe mental disabilities and psychiatric conditions. The castle-like buildings that had been meant to inspire hope in tuberculosis patients now confined people with schizophrenia, severe depression, developmental disabilities, and other conditions that 1950s medicine had few effective treatments for. The era of large state mental institutions was at its peak, and conditions in many such facilities ranged from merely inadequate to genuinely horrifying. Patients lived for years, sometimes decades, in institutional care. Treatments included electroshock therapy, powerful sedatives, and isolation. The beautiful Gothic architecture became a cruel irony, a medieval fortress indeed, but one that imprisoned rather than protected. Stories began to circulate among the local population. Night workers at the hospital reported strange occurrences in the older wings, the sections that dated back to the original sanatorium. They spoke of hearing footsteps in empty corridors, of cold spots that defied explanation, of seeing figures in old-fashioned clothing walking through walls where doors had once been. Some claimed to hear the sound of a woman weeping, always from the direction of the administrative building where the sanatorium's original entrance had been. A few swore they had seen an elderly woman in Victorian dress standing at windows that had been bricked over decades earlier. The hospital staff largely dismissed these stories as products of overactive imaginations, the result of working night shifts in an old, creaky building. But the stories persisted, grew more detailed, and began to form a pattern. The apparitions were most frequently reported on November 15th, the anniversary of Margaret Carnegie's death. The woman in Victorian dress was described consistently, small in stature, with silver hair, wearing dark clothing of the 1880s style. She seemed to be searching for something, looking into rooms, peering down corridors, her expression one of profound sadness and worry. One particularly chilling account came from a night nurse in 1978. She was making rounds in the former tuberculosis ward, now housing psychiatric patients, when she saw an elderly woman in outdated clothing standing beside one of the beds. The nurse approached, assuming this was a confused patient who had wandered from another wing. But as she drew closer, the woman turned to face her, and the nurse saw that her eyes were filled with tears. The woman spoke, her voice clear but somehow distant. "I'm looking for my son. He's very ill. He needs me." Before the nurse could respond, the figure simply faded away, becoming transparent and then vanishing entirely. The nurse fled the ward and refused to work night shifts in that building again. The psychiatric hospital closed in 1982, another victim of changing attitudes toward mental health treatment and budget cuts. The buildings sat empty for a brief period, and during that time, local teenagers and amateur ghost hunters made pilgrimages to the abandoned complex. Their stories added to the legends. They reported hearing organ music echoing through empty halls, though all the musical instruments had been removed when the hospital closed. They claimed to see lights moving through rooms where the electricity had been shut off. One group of teenagers broke into the old chapel and swore they heard a woman's voice singing a Scottish lullaby, the words indistinct, but the melody mournful and ancient. In 1983, the complex underwent its final, most disturbing transformation. The State Correctional Institution at Crescent opened, converting the castle-like sanatorium and hospital into a maximum security prison. The buildings that had been designed to heal, that had housed the sick and the mentally ill, now confined violent criminals. The irony was profound and deeply unsettling. Carnegie's gift of healing land, his attempt to create something good from the site of his personal tragedy, had become a place of punishment and confinement. The prison operated for 30 years, and during that time the reports of paranormal activity did not cease. In fact, they intensified. Corrections officers reported seeing the Victorian woman with increasing frequency. She appeared in cell blocks, in administrative offices, in the prison yard. She seemed particularly drawn to solitary confinement areas, as if the isolation of prisoners reminded her of something from her own experience. Inmates, many of whom knew nothing of the facility's history, independently reported dreams of an old woman who came to their cells at night, looking worried and asking about someone who was ill. The most disturbing incidents occurred in what had been the original sanatorium building, the Gothic structure with its gargoyles and Scottish crests. This section of the complex had been converted to house administrative offices and the prison's medical facilities. Staff members working late at night frequently reported an overwhelming sense of sadness and loss in certain rooms. Medical personnel sometimes felt as if they were being watched while treating inmates. The prison psychologist noted that inmates who spent time in the medical wing often spoke of feeling an oppressive sorrow that had nothing to do with their own circumstances, as if the very walls were saturated with decades of grief. One corrections officer who worked at Crescent for 15 years before it closed shared his experience anonymously. He had been skeptical of ghost stories, dismissing the rumors as nonsense meant to scare new employees. But his skepticism ended one November night when he was conducting a security check of the administrative building. As he walked down a corridor in the oldest section, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see another officer, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, clearly audible, keeping pace with him as he walked. When he stopped, they stopped. When he moved, they moved. And then he heard it, a woman's voice, old and frail, calling out a name. "Andrew, Andrew, where are you?" The officer ran from the building and refused to go back into that section alone. The State Correctional Institution at Crescent closed in 2013. The facility had become too expensive to maintain, and the state's prison system was consolidating operations. The buildings were abandoned, left to decay on the wind-swept summit where Carnegie had once dreamed of building his castle. For several years, the complex stood empty, slowly deteriorating. Windows broke. Roofs leaked. Vegetation began to reclaim the grounds. The castle-like structure that had served so many dark purposes was finally silent. But even in abandonment, the site maintained its strange hold on human imagination. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators made pilgrimages to the ruins. Their photographs and videos, shared across social media and paranormal websites, showed a place of haunting beauty and unmistakable melancholy. The Gothic architecture, now crumbling, looked more like the ruins of an actual medieval castle than ever before. Nature was reclaiming Carnegie's summit, erasing the institutions that had occupied it, perhaps trying to return it to what it might have been. In the photographs from these explorations, certain patterns emerged. The same locations were consistently described as feeling wrong, oppressive, sorrowful. The former medical wing, the old chapel, the administrative building where the sanatorium's main entrance had been, and strangest of all, an area of the grounds where no building had ever stood, a slight rise with a view overlooking the valleys below. This was the exact spot where Carnegie's castle was to have been built, where Olmsted's plans showed the Great Hall would have stood. Multiple independent visitors reported the same experience at this location. They felt as if they were standing inside a building that wasn't there, as if walls and rooms existed on some level that eyes couldn't see, but bodies could sense. They described walking through doorways in empty air, feeling the temperature change as they moved from room to room. Some claimed to hear music, faint and far away, the sound of a piano playing melancholy Scottish melodies. A few saw, just for moments, the shimmer of what looked like a grand hall, with a massive stone fireplace and heavy wooden beams, before the vision faded back to empty, overgrown land. One paranormal investigator who visited the site multiple times between 2014 and 2018 became convinced that what people were experiencing was not a traditional haunting, but something more complex. She theorized that the site was haunted by a castle that never existed, by the ghost of an unlived future. Carnegie's dreams for the location had been so powerful, his plans so detailed, his emotional investment so profound, that they had somehow imprinted on the location. The castle that should have been built had left a kind of psychic footprint, an echo of potential that never became reality. This theory was simultaneously fascinating and heartbreaking. If true, it meant that Carnegie's grief had been so profound that it had altered the very nature of the place he had chosen for his mother's happiness. His abandonment of the project, his inability to transform his dreams into reality, had created a kind of void that decades of institutional use could never fill. The sanatorium, the hospital, the prison, all of these had been attempts to give the land purpose, but perhaps the land itself was grieving for what it had been meant to become. In 2017, an unusual development gave the abandoned site new purpose. A company purchased part of the property and converted sections of it into a hydroponic farm, growing produce in the old prison buildings. This agricultural use was both practical and deeply symbolic. A place that had been devoted to healing, then to confinement, now nourished life in the most literal sense. Plants grew in spaces where tuberculous patients had gasped for air, where psychiatric patients had been sedated into silence, where prisoners had served their sentences. It was as if someone finally understood what Carnegie had intended, that this summit should sustain life, should provide something good and necessary to the world. The farm operation opened portions of the site for tours, allowing visitors to see the history of the location while witnessing its transformation. People could walk through cell blocks, now filled with rows of plants growing under LED lights. They could stand in the Gothic chapel, where agricultural equipment was now stored. They could learn about tuberculosis treatment, mental health history, and prison reform, while seeing how the buildings were being adapted for a new century. But the tours also acknowledged the site's strange reputation. Guides spoke openly about the reports of paranormal activity, about Margaret Carnegie's ghost, about the phantom castle that visitors sometimes felt but could not see. They told the story of Andrew Carnegie's abandoned dream, of how grief and guilt had transformed 500 acres meant for joy into more than a century of sorrow. Some visitors on these tours reported their own experiences. They felt sudden cold in warm rooms. They heard sounds that had no source. They saw movement in their peripheral vision that disappeared when they turned to look directly, but most commonly, they felt sadness, profound and inexplicable sadness that seemed to well up from the ground itself. The tour guides noted that these experiences were most frequent on two dates: November 15th, the anniversary of Margaret Carnegie's death, and May 1st, which would have been the planned groundbreaking for Carnegie's castle according to Olmsted's construction schedule. It was as if the site itself remembered these significant dates, mourning what had been lost and what had never been. Today, the Crescent Summit remains a place of contradiction and mystery. The hydroponic farm continues to operate, bringing life and purpose to buildings that had known so much suffering. But the Gothic architecture, the castle-like features, the Scottish crests carved into stone walls, all of these remain silent testimony to Carnegie's abandoned dream. The land that was meant to be a private paradise became a public institution, then another, and finally a strange hybrid of history and agriculture. The full extent of the original property, Carnegie's 500 acres, stretches beyond the buildings that were eventually constructed. Much of it is still forested, still wild, still bearing the marks of Olmsted's preliminary surveys from 1886. Walking those woods, you can still find the stakes and markers that Olmsted's crews placed, identifying where carriage roads were to be built, where the gardens were to be planted, where the private lake was to be created. These weathered wooden stakes, now more than a century old, are monuments to dreams deferred, potential unfulfilled. And on certain nights, particularly in November, locals claim that if you stand on the summit at dusk and look toward where Carnegie's castle should have been built, you can see lights in windows that don't exist. You can hear the sound of music from a party that was never held. You can catch the scent of roses from gardens that were never planted. The ghost of the castle appears, they say, not as a solid structure, but as a shimmer in the air, a suggestion of what might have been, a monument built from grief and longing rather than stone and mortar. Perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps this is Carnegie's true fortress, not a physical structure but an emotional one, a castle built from memory and loss, protecting nothing and confining everything. His silent fortress is not silent because it stands empty. It is silent because it was never built, because the dreams that would have filled it died with his mother in that cold November. The story of Carnegie's Crescent estate is the story of how grief can transform intention, how personal tragedy can shape landscapes in ways that outlast any building. It is a story about the castles we plan but never build, the futures we imagine but never live, the dreams we abandon when the people we love are taken from us. And it is a story about how land remembers, how sites can be haunted, not just by what happened there, but by what was supposed to happen and never did. Andrew Carnegie went on to build Skibo Castle in Scotland, creating there the Highland retreat he had envisioned for Crescent. He lived there happily for years with his wife and daughter. But those who knew him well said he was never quite the same after his mother's death. He threw himself into philanthropy, giving away almost his entire fortune, funding libraries, universities, concert halls, and charitable institutions across America and around the world. Perhaps he was trying to build in the world what he could not build for his mother. Perhaps every library was a wing of the castle she never saw. Perhaps every university building was a tower in the fortress that remained only in his heart. Carnegie died in 1919, wealthy beyond measure, yet having lost what mattered most decades earlier. He was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York, far from the Crescent Summit where his greatest dream had died. But perhaps, in some way, a part of him remained there, haunting the castle that never was, walking through rooms that exist only in architectural drawings and aging memories. The forgotten estate of the Steel King is forgotten not because history overlooked it, but because it never existed in the first place. It is a fortress made of what might have been, a castle constructed from the building blocks of human grief and regret. And in that sense, it may be the most honest monument ever created to the cost of great ambition, to the price of success, and to the truth that all our wealth and power cannot protect us from the simplest and most devastating losses. If you've been moved by this story of dreams lost and lands transformed, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more forgotten histories and untold tales from America's past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you visited the Crescent site? Have you experienced something unexplainable at a location with a tragic history? Let us know your stories. The silent fortress stands still on its Pennsylvania summit, visible only to those who know where to look and what to see. It stands as a reminder that the most powerful monuments are sometimes the ones that were never built, that the strongest walls are the ones constructed from memory and longing, and that true fortresses protect not treasures of gold and steel, but the fragile, irreplaceable treasures of human love and connection that, once lost, can never be replaced, no matter how many libraries we build, how many universities we endow, or how many tons of steel bear our name.